Okay, well, thank you for coming tonight, everybody. And it's nice to see so many of my faculty colleagues here, so many students. This is the second of our Freedom Seminar lecture series. We do have more upcoming. So for example, next week in this very same auditorium at 6 p.m., we have a talk by Eric Nager about a plan for entitlement reform that will save Social Security and Medicare, actually transform them and make them sustainable financially. And that's next week. Then we've got other events that you can find on our website. Just go to www.northwood.freedomseminar.com and you can see the whole schedule of events. So I hope many of you come back for those. So tonight, we're on the eve of celebrating Black History Month. And as we celebrate the various contributions of Black Americans to significant events in American history, we here at America's Free Enterprise University are particularly interested in a theme of how they contributed to our prosperity. And we've invited an expert, Burton Folsom, to talk to you about that theme. Now, this might not be your usual Black History Month speech. There have been people who have suggested that capitalism is actually incompatible with equality of opportunity, with upward mobility, that it leaves certain marginalized groups behind. In fact, Ibram Kendi at Harvard University has said capitalism and racism are conjoined twins. Well, Burton Folsom is going to present an alternative perspective to that thesis. I believe he's going to make the case that capitalism has actually created opportunities for all Americans, and all Americans have been taking advantage of those opportunities to make themselves and the rest of us better off. So I want to tell you a little bit about tonight's speaker. Dr. Burt Folsom is Professor Emeritus of History and a Distinguished Fellow of Hillsdale College. He has spent his whole life energized by the belief that freedom and free markets benefit all people. He has published 11 books, some co-authored, and also hundreds of columns and articles in newspapers and journals. And he has published several books, including The Myth of the Robber Barons and Empire Builders, How Michigan Entrepreneurs Helped Make America Great. So his appearance at tonight's Freedom Seminar is made possible with the generous support of Young America's Foundation. Young America's Foundation is committed to ensuring that increasing numbers of young Americans understand and are inspired by the ideas of individual freedom, strong defense, free enterprise, and traditional values. More information about the activities of Young America's Foundation is available at their website, www.yaf.org. And there's also some literature about YAF on the table as you enter and exit the auditorium. So please help me welcome Dr. Burton Folsom.
Thank you, Dale, and it's great to be here. And thanks to Northwood University, and thanks to America's Foundation. They're a wonderful group. Dale mentioned the table back there that has material from Young America's Foundation, and help yourself to that. In fact, if some of you are interested, it would be great to have a chapter, a Young America's Foundation chapter here at Northwood. But in any case, I'm glad to be here. And you know, you might be thinking, what in the world's going on? Black History Month, and how does that fit into Northwood, and how does that fit in exactly to ideas? Dr. Matchak mentioned, you know, capitalism. Some people connect it with racism, that sort of thing. No, Black History Month. I want to think of in a couple ways. I don't want to talk about people. Sometimes you get Black History Month and there you get reference to, let's talk about a famous Black American. People here and there, especially that's sad when they pick politicians, because really politicians use of transferring income from one group to another group to get votes, and we certainly don't want to spend a month celebrating that. We have to spend the other 11 months living with that. We shouldn't have to spend 1 month celebrating it. So the politicians are out on this month from the standpoint of key developments and key Black figures that did a lot to change American history and increase American prosperity. I want to start with right after the Civil War, 1865, because then we get finally freedom for Black Americans. In a sense, we get the 13th Amendment, which removes slavery from the picture. And then in the next 5 years, we get the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. 14th Amendment was civil rights, where you have citizenship given to Blacks and due process of law put into effect. The 15th Amendment giving Black Americans the vote. So that's one fact that happens in the 5 years after 1865. There is another fact that I want to mention that happens after 1865 too, and that is that we have an 1870 census, and at the census we ask in effect we ask for adults, white and Black, can you read and write? Are you literate, in effect? And those figures are kind of interesting. Anybody want to take a guess on what the white literacy rate was? 91%. 91% were literate, 9 were illiterate. Any guess on Black literacy? Have some speculation here? 3%? Yeah. Anybody else? Higher or lower? Higher or lower, do you think? Andrew? Higher? How much higher? 10%? Maybe 10%. 10%. But higher, 10%. You think higher or lower than?
I'd say like 7.
7. Okay. Because of course, it was illegal in some states to teach slaves how to read or write. But remember, they're free Blacks in the picture. Because we have a lot of people who were anti-slavery who were involved in getting slaves freedom. And so when we had the Underground Railroad giving freedom, and some of those free Blacks are going to be literate. Yeah, 10%, what do you think? Any? Between 10 and 20. That's actually the best guess so far. And I've got to admit, when I ask this question, even of my colleagues, often the answer is more like the ones you were giving, single digit. It's 19%. But what that means, if we put this up, if we were to have 10 typical whites in 1870, 9 of them would be reader literate. If we had 10 blacks lined up here beside them, 8 would be illiterate, 2 would be literate. Now, that's a fact. So we've got 2 facts. We've got these laws, the new amendments, and we have this literacy. Is this literacy issue significant or not? Is that more important than the fact that we have the amendments? It's interesting to ponder. I see the wheel, I can sense the wheels going around. Gee, is that really important? I'd like to pose the idea to you that it's more important than the amendments. Not because I think it should be more important than the amendments, but because I'm a historian and I saw read about and studied what happened in the 30 years after the Civil War. The illiteracy trumped the amendments. We thought we could just put the 14th and 15th Amendments in after the 13th, and everything is going to be taken care of. You cannot enforce laws if you don't have community support for these laws. And the problem was that many white Americans did not accept that black Americans should be voting. They'd come up there, and here would be the argument that you'd hear. You mean to tell me, now this is vote. How do you vote if you can't read or write? Well, of course you sit there and say, because somebody's going to buy their vote. That's not going to be a legit vote. How can they understand issues if they can't read or write? I mean, it'll be hard. I'm not saying it's impossible. That's going to make it difficult. And so the argument is that some people made is that blacks were virtually subhuman. Now, granted, in this literacy business and the voting, we're going to get black people in Congress. In the 1865, remember the last year of the Civil War, we're the starting point here. In the next 65 years, we're going to have 23 black members of Congress, 21 in the House and 2 in the Senate. How do you think that will be divided by political party? You know, like half and half, or mostly one party, mostly the other? Any thoughts on that?
Mostly Republican?
Mostly, Andrew says mostly Republican. Why do you say that? Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, right? You agree or disagree with Andrew here? Mostly Democrat? Mostly Republican? How many say mostly Republican? Well, it's not just mostly Republican. It's 23 Republicans, 0 Democrats. Those 2 U.S. senators, the 21 members of the House, and some governors as well, every single one was a Republican. The Democrats, now see, this is interesting, isn't it? Because they're integrated into the Republican Party. The Republican Party, the antecedents of the Republican Party are the people who were anti-slavery, the people who believed that freedom was a natural right. They believed in the Constitution. They believed in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for black Americans, that they applied, and they needed to be free. And in fact, if you go back 70 years, those people who were in that camp, those 23 Republicans, and those who supported and helped elect them, the whites, were in the category of saying that we should have freedom even back when we had our Constitution. There was no place in the world where slavery wasn't practiced. It was legal everywhere in the world. The debate in Congress didn't end a debate on slavery. It began a debate on slavery because our founders had become, in the previous generation, uncertain that that was a good idea anymore. And so what we have are practically every founding father who signed the Constitution was not in favor of slavery, even those who owned slaves. And many of those founders eventually freed their slaves, like George Washington. He freed everyone, and he had pensions for them. Because he said, I'm concerned if I free them, they're not going to be able to get jobs. They'll be discriminated against. He provided pensions for his slaves that were paid for the next 30-some years. He died in 1799. They were technically, since some of them belonged to Martha, they were not totally free till the next year, 1800, and the pensions were paid until the early 1830s. The founders were not supporting slavery. Washington tried to get it abolished in the Virginia legislature when Thomas Jefferson was governor. The both of them were tried. They couldn't get the votes. This is the old deal. You don't have the votes. But in the first 15 years of our country, from 1789, Constitution's in effect, to 1804, 15 years, we had the original 13 states plus 4 more had come into the Union. Out of those 17 states, more than half abolished slavery quickly. So you have half the Union where there is no slavery by vote of the people in that state. Now that tells you something, because these are mostly white people, although the blacks were given the vote in many of these states too. In fact, blacks had the vote in some southern states when they were free. Tennessee and North Carolina being 2 of them. Free blacks had the vote if you were free. So what you have here is a situation where there is a significant group of people who wanted the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. They go back to the beginning of our country. These are white Americans. And that group is still there after the Civil War, but they're there in smaller numbers, and they're in the Republican Party. The Republican Party is not the majority party in the South. The Democrat Party, which is where the Ku Klux Klan was started, was a wing. The Ku Klux Klan was literally a wing of the Democratic Party that said blacks were subhuman. And they began using so-called evidence from evolution, that we had like these apes and gorillas, and then we have blacks, and then we have whites. And so you can't treat these people as equals. They're not entitled to natural rights. These were arguments that were floating around in the late 1800s. We find them absolutely deplorable, reprehensible today. But these were legit arguments that were on the field winning votes for the Democratic Party. And the Republican Party found themselves in a position. We can either help the blacks in the South, which in effect is the Republican Party, and it was mostly Republican presidents after the Civil War, so they can say, we can either help our colleagues and our party members, white and black in the South, but if we do that, it's going to cost a fortune in military to get them down there, because the sentiment is not there that those rights in the 15th Amendment voting and the 14th Amendment civil rights should be given to blacks because they're not worthy of it. And they can't read or write. See, the read or write comes where they're ignorant people, is the argument. The challenge from 1870, after that census, to 1930, in the next 60 years, all black Americans talked about it. We need to have a more literate group of people. That 19% has got to be jacked way up. That's point number one. And point number two, and this is one that many black Americans sensed. It wasn't obvious, but they sensed it and they said it. We not only have to get more educated so that we can be knowledgeable and, in effect, blend in with our backgrounds, we need to add value. This isn't going to work until whites think we're good people and we add value and we need to have them around. See, that's very easy today. You think of like somebody may be doing Black History Month this month, and they'll pick Shirley Jackson, first PhD Black from MIT, first woman and first Black woman PhD at MIT. She, a while ago when we still had phones before the iPhone era, she invented the touch tone dialing, which made it easier to dial. She invented caller ID. She invented this portable fax machine. See, when you're doing inventions like that, nobody says, boy, who wants Shirley Jackson around? We want her around. She adds value to our lives. We see this now, but the argument back then, they don't have a Shirley Jackson. So what is going to happen here? And a lot of it is not the blacks' fault. They were not allowed to read or write in many states. But there's a tremendous amount of makeup that has to be done from 1870 to 30. Number one, so that your profile of achievements in the way of literacy looks like the white profile. And number two, you have, I mentioned Shirley Jackson, people who, oh yeah, look at what these people did. We need them around. And it's going to be that was precisely accomplished. Maybe not fully, but it was somewhat accomplished enough that generation paved the way for the later Civil Rights Bill and Supreme Court decisions, Brown versus Board with integrated education. All of these things were the foundation is laid by what was achieved by Black Americans from 1870 to 1930. Now, in getting to this, I want to say a couple things here, and that is that we need to talk now finally about a specific Black American. How many of you could identify fewer than 6% can identify this man? George Washington Carver. How many could give a definition of George Washington Carver? Andrew, help us out.
Serial inventor.
An inventor? Okay. That might pass. That's a little vague, right? I mean, like, did he invent cornflakes or did he invent something else? I mean,
He invented like hundreds of products out of the peanut.
there you go. You've got it. That's the guy. George Washington Carver. And the odd thing is that in Black History Month, I don't think I've ever seen him emphasized that much. He is the major person. And in the minds of many people who have ranked scientists in the United States, the only scientist of the era that ranks ahead of him is Thomas Edison. And just to put this in perspective, Edison offered Carver today's dollars, $2 million to work for him. He never offered that to anybody except for George Washington Carver. So that tells you something about Edison's ranking of Carver. Carver was just a kid born in the Civil War. He was born into this is the interesting thing. Of course, he has a slave parent, but the father died, and he was in Missouri. This is in Missouri. And he and his mother, and he had a brother. They were bought by a family in Missouri. But they were bought not to be slaves, but because the people in Missouri were anti-slavery, and they said, now we can just have them as family members. Yeah, they're not slaves. They're just going to help. They're going to hang out with us. They're going to eat at the same table we do. And they ended up with George Washington Carver. They homeschooled him. His name was Moses Carver, and his wife's name was Susan Carver, and that's where George obviously gets his name. But Susan homeschooled him, and what she saw in that little boy was the most curious mind, and the mind that could just remember details. incredible details. Like somebody come along and say, these are 10 different leaves from trees. Now, of course, it'll take you all a while to remember all these leaves and identify them with the tree. And then he'd go on to something else and come back and he says, now, does anybody want to try to guess who could match what with what tree? And little George matches every one. And he loved plants. And Susan, the mother, I mean, his in effect surrogate mother, said, you need to go to school, but they didn't have a school for blacks in their little town in Missouri. He had to walk 10 miles, 8 years old, walking 10 miles to school. Now that's dedication. I mean, in Michigan here, it was at least it was warm. I mean, this is good weather here, but can you imagine in a typical winter walking 8 miles to come to Northwood? That would be, we'd be impressed. Dr. Moots, would you be impressed with that?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Well, anyway, what we have is a situation where George Washington Carver goes to this town that has a black school. The lady says, well, we're all full up. And he says, can I stand outside the door and listen? Now, students, I tell you something, as a professor, sometimes we get our classes capped. And I say, no, I can't take any more. Our classes are capped. I've never had anybody say, can I stand outside and listen? But I'll tell you, if I did, I would say, yes, you can. And I would find some way to overrule the departmental policy and get that kid in the class. I'd check to see if he really would do it. If he was out there for a couple classes listening, then I'd bring him in and see, what have you learned? And if he passed it, he would be in the class. I don't care what the rule is. I said, then I'll add you at the end of the semester. Or I'll put you on the enrollment for next year and you don't even have to attend. You'll pass it now. Some way we're going to get you 3 hours credit for my class. And that's exactly what that lady did. He was out there. She finally just said, come in here, and he becomes part of the class. He does. She had him doing all sorts of work and service to earn his stay there. And he loved school, and he went through a couple of years of school there, and they couldn't go up very high. And so she said, well, maybe you can go to another place. And he's just, in effect, this orphan on the road, and he's getting schooling here and there. He's working odd jobs. Yeah, he has sometimes situations like some white people stole his books one time. Then he had to go work again to earn the money to go back to school. It took him, he was more than 20 when he graduated from high school. Then he wanted to go to college. He applied to Highland College in Kansas. They accepted him. He came there all excited, and they said, oh, you didn't tell us you were a Negro. You can't come. He spends all his money to come to Highland in Kansas, and they tell him, no, you can't. You're a Negro. This won't work. We don't accept Negroes. He earned his way to try to go somewhere else. He ended up in Iowa, and he got to Iowa State, and he kind of made a good impression on some of the faculty members there. Good enough, they said, we'll let you take some entrance tests. Now, he had studied plants, and by this time, he knew he could identify on different plants over 100 funguses that cause problems for the plants, and he had ways of removing the fungus, and you kind of graft on something else. In other words, he was doing this all the time because he just loved plants and animals. And so he started doing that, and they could say, whoa, this guy really. In fact, one of the professors said, I think this guy who isn't even a freshman knows more than I do about how to do. Now, I didn't realize you could do some of the grafting jobs he was doing. And so they say, we're a merit system, and we're going to let you in. They let him in, and he excelled so much. One of the major professors there said he was the most outstanding student at Iowa State. He was the first black in Ames, Iowa State University. The first. And when he graduated, he got a master's, and he then became the first black professor at Iowa State University. They didn't want to lose him. He felt called by God. One of his early teachers, when he went off at first to go to school, had said, George, you are a remarkable learner. You have learned so much. You need to return that learning to your people and to the nation. You get that? In effect, black and white are going to benefit. And he took that as the theme of his life. And he said, I'd love to stay here. They offered him a great salary at Iowa State. And he said, when Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee in Alabama offered him a job at $1,500 a year, a salary which was never raised during his entire 43 years there, he took it. I'm going to go down to the deep south and do what I can to make my people fit in their knowledge with the rest of white society. I'm going to do everything I can to impart what I know to them and have this happen. And in the process, we're going to add value to the nation. That was his goal. He went down there. Booker T. Washington, the president, said, I'm sorry, we have no laboratory. The laboratory is the brain in your head. He got those students, there were 13 students. And the key here is, remember, the theme here, we have white people from the 1780s all the way up who are trying to help. They're just outnumbered. Those people were trying to get black education going. White man, Christian, Samuel Armstrong founds Hampton Institute in Virginia. Booker T. Washington graduates from Hampton Institute and starts Tuskegee in Alabama. I went to Hillsdale College. Clinton Fisk went to Hillsdale College and was a general in the Civil War. He went down, he was stationed in Nashville after the war, and he asked the black people in Nashville, what can I do to help? Hillsdale College was co-ed, and it took blacks and whites. It was the second college in the nation that was integrated. And started in the 1840s. So, I mean, he had black students with him. He says, what can I do to help? He was in Nashville. And they said, education. And so he gave the money for Fisk University, which became a major black institution. Another white man, Samuel Meharry, came into Nashville and said, oh, they've got a college. Let's build up and make Nashville a center of black education. And he founded Meharry Medical School. It becomes the medical school for black Americans in the country. White people were helping with this. From 1870 to the time of the Civil War, there were 3 black colleges. In 1930, there were over 100. A lot of those graduates went right out and into the classroom to educate other blacks. This is the we've got to pull ourselves up effect that's happening all around the country. A lot of blacks tried to do this. Howard University was in Washington, D.C., a major one named after a Civil War general, and then also became a major black school. So whites are often involved, not 100% of the time, but most of the time, whites are in some way involved. Of course, that's where the money is. But it's that thread of people from the 1780s all the way up is trying to help. They're just in a minority, and the blacks are going to have to do a lot by themselves. Once we get these colleges, that's exactly what happened. Booker T. Carver is down there at Alabama, and he's got these students in his what he says, I'm going to teach you about plants. I'm going to teach you about corn. I'm going to teach you about crops. I'm going to teach you about nutrients. We had vitamins that were finally, see, we didn't know anything about vitamin A, B, C. We take that for granted. That was in the early 1900s. People thought food is food, which sounds good because then I just eat dessert all the time, right? But they find out some have nutrients and some don't. Unfortunately, the stuff that tastes good is often the stuff that doesn't have the nutrients. But that's good to know that. At least I know that. I say that, well, I'm just going to sneak this piece of pie here. But I'll eat some sweet potatoes in the next meal. You know, I'll get some compromise. And we all sort of do that. Well, we learn about vitamins. Carver was teaching those students. He says, I'm teaching you, and I want you to go back into your communities and help those people farm and learn what to do and make them better. And we're going to raise ourselves up as a race. Something that seemed to be a disaster turned out to be a blessing in a way. The cotton crop collapsed because of the boll weevil. That is the staple in the Deep South, cotton. And the boll weevil, this like quarter-inch insect that goes in there and lays eggs in the cotton boll, was destroyed the southern cotton crop. And that's when Carver shifted into here and he says, that's okay. Cotton depletes the soil. And you have to understand that. Second, peanuts, which Andrew mentioned, contain loads of nutrients and it's good for the soil. So are sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes are loaded. He had 107 different products that could be made from the sweet potato. And for the peanut, he had about 150. And what Carver would do, because I'm not a scientist, so I have trouble on what I can sort of visualize it. He'd take a peanut, and he said, I did this. Every morning, Carver would wake up at 4 o'clock, and he'd spend an hour praying. And he'd say, God, what should we do today? He'd say, I'm working with the peanut. Can you help? And so he'd get these ideas in the middle of the prayer. And I'd come in there, for example, a peanut, he'd break it up into pieces, like little grains. Then he'd take a vise and just compress it, and then he'd heat it. And he says the most fascinating array of products came out of this peanut. The way that he ended up demonstrating this, because he wanted to take his case to groups of people around the country. And the way he did it was he'd have a conference in the counties. He'd have prominent citizens. He says, we're scheduling a conference. We're doing it for you. We're going to help you. We've got a solution to the cotton problem. Come in and go to this. He says, the peanut is the solution, but we're going to serve you all lunch. And the lunch consisted of this: soup, and then it had something that was like chicken, but it wasn't chicken, but people thought it's kind of like chicken. Then a vegetable, a salad with salad dressing, coffee, and ice cream for dessert. After they were done, he'd say, now I want to tell you about the peanut and all the uses that we have for the peanut. I look around the room and I see people who don't think the peanut has that much going for it other than, yeah, they might be good to munch on. I mean, nowadays at a ball game, something like that. He said, okay, peanuts, yeah, food occasionally. Everything you ate at lunch today was made from peanuts, including the ice cream. And there'd be this kind of gasp. Everything all of you ate is from peanuts that my students and I prepared for you today. Well, people wanted to listen. And he sort of explained it, and he said, you don't need cotton. You can produce these peanuts, and they have these and more. He said, listen to all the ingredients. He says, you can make paper. From the shells, you can compress them and have lumber briquettes for firewood with peanut shells. Medicine, there were salves that were actually medicinal that came out of the peanut. Shaving cream, soap, even some that were medicinal. Hemophiliacs could have their problem with bleeding arrested in part by ingesting material from peanuts that he had gotten, that Carver had removed from the peanut. He even had a partial contribution to peanut. And then other things he put in, and he had an insecticide. And the insecticide became actually profitable enterprise. They had to fumigate the dorms. You know, they had bed bugs and things like that. And so Tuskegee was able to use this and then sell it to other people. All of these from plants and peanuts, and some from the sweet potatoes. It was so transformative that suddenly all of the central part of Alabama, where Tuskegee was, became among the wealthiest counties where Tuskegee was in the state. Now, do you see where blacks are doing this, but whites are saying, wait a minute, I plant cotton. Maybe I should be going into peanuts. Let me get George Washington Carver in here to talk about it. He all of a sudden began to reach a national audience, and that's where Edison, he went before Congress in 1921 and had an extensive talk. They looked at him and they said, he looks a strange man. Let's give him 10 minutes. And after 10 minutes, they said, we need more. And they ended up with over 2 hours. We have it in the congressional record. And Carver was good. In fact, he was very free market because people were saying, maybe we need tariffs on stuff. And Carver said, yeah, tariffs are always a good thing to inflict on your adversary. I mean, Carver saw through a lot of that right there. It's in the congressional record. So you have Carver, and Edison wanted to hire him for $2 million. Now, this is where, there's too much of an economist in me to not think that through. I mean, you're getting, let me see here. Dr. Matchek, Dr. Moots, or bring in bring Andrew in on this and other. $2 million for 1 year at Edison, or $1,500 here at Tuskegee. I mean, I have to say this. I would be tempted to say, Edison, I'll go with you for 1 year, and then bring the $2 million down to Tuskegee and say, look, I just saved you that. But Carver said, my job is to not go out there and fundraise. My job is to go out there and teach my students and have them go out. Carver became the most prominent black in the United States, especially after Booker T. Washington died, because Washington was up there, maybe ahead of him. But once Washington was gone, Carver was there. Let me give you an example. We had 2 billionaires in U.S. history in Carver's time when he was alive. John D. Rockefeller and Henry Ford. Carver knew both, and both interacted with him. Ford interacted with him regularly. Rockefeller donated a laboratory for Carver at Tuskegee. So Rockefeller Hall is where Carver was doing his experiments. I mean, these are people who say, I want to invest in a winner. This guy's a winner. He's not just a winner because he's black, he's a winner for the country. When I start a lab for Carver, I'm improving the whole country, Rockefeller said. Henry Ford just absolutely loved Carver. The two would get together, they would laugh, they would talk. Ford, how have you been to Dearborn? Have a lot of you been to the Ford? Have you seen Carver's house? Where they ended up, Ford brought his house over there. They agreed to meet and talk at least once a year. And they'd get together at least once a year and hang out. The other person who Carver had that was the Vice President of the United States, Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace's father was a professor at Iowa State when he was there. And he took the kid under his wing and taught him a lot about plants. And Henry Wallace became Secretary of Agriculture under Franklin Roosevelt. And this time it's a Democrat. Well, I mean, all these people are Republicans. This guy was a Democrat, and he's the Vice President of the United States in the 1940s. So here you have George Washington Carver. He's a friend of the 2 billionaires in U.S. history. He knows the Vice President. And he's on the road promoting Tuskegee and promoting products to make lives better and to add value to this country. Yeah, there would be racism that would come into play. He would go there to give speeches. He's invited, and he's this famous man, and they won't let him in, and he had to take the service elevator up to the speech. And he had other speeches where he would give the speech, but they didn't serve blacks, so he couldn't eat a meal with the speech. It's a lunch speech, and everybody gets lunch but Carver. Carver always said, do not get caught up in the details of hateful people. And it's funny because you read these now, all these books online, how to be your best self. And it says, don't carry grudges. Well, see, Carver would talk to his students and say, don't give in to the haters and feed on that. We're doing something. We're laying a foundation, and the foundation we lay will be good for us. It'll be good for the nation. And even some of the haters may come around. Do not get sidetracked. I don't let myself get sidetracked when these things happen. But I know about plants. I know plants and how they grow. And what we're growing is a very positive plant here. It's a plant of racial harmony. It's a plant of economic development for the United States. And I'm watching it grow, and I know how plants grow. I'm not seeing the full bloom on this plant right now, but it's going to come. It may not come during my lifetime, but we're building now to get better later. When Carver died in 1943, in his 80s, he was mourned. I mean, people writing on him, all New York Times, everybody. One of our greatest scientists is gone. Edison is gone, and now Carver's gone. Maybe our two best. He was right. The bloom came later, and this is the last. I have about 3 or 4 more minutes because I want to talk at one area that fulfilled what Carver said, and that is the sports area. Carver created a situation where black literacy had gone from 19%, or he had been part of the solution here. 19%, in 1930, it was 84% black literacy. So now the whites are in the 90s, 90, 89, 90, 91, and blacks are at 84. The blacks served in World War II in a very honorable way. And the argument, and then Carver, look at the value. The whole American South is more prosperous because of George Washington Carver. We don't want to keep these people down anymore. The whole idea of attitudes toward blacks, I wish we had surveys that we could plot that. It changes. It begins to change by the night. Oh, sure, there's some still around, but they're all of a sudden the shift is on, and the sports is the final cap to it. Jackie Robinson, as you know, come in to the Brooklyn Dodgers, and I have this down. The Brooklyn Dodgers had won one pennant in their entire existence until Jackie Robinson joined the team in 1947. Robinson's on the team, and other blacks came along with him. A good catcher named Roy Campanella, who's black. Don Newcomb, a pitcher who won 27 games one season. Really good players. Brooklyn, now the Los Angeles Dodgers. Then there were the Brooklyn Dodgers. They're called the Dodgers, by the way, because they were right next to a trolley line, and they had to dodge the trolley to get to the ball field. So they're called the Trolley Dodgers, and they just shortened that to the Dodgers. The Brooklyn Dodgers won the pennant one time up until 1947. Then they won in 1947, 1949, 1952, 1953, 1955, 1956. 6 times in the next 10 years. The Detroit Tigers, I regret to say, was the next to last team to integrate. They did it in 1958. Boston Red Sox were the last in 1959. The Detroit Tigers won the World Series in 1945. Boston won in 46. You get that? And they refused to integrate. And all of a sudden, they're at the bottom of the American League in the 50s. And then finally they integrate. It takes them both a long time to get back to having the kind of strength that remotely was like they once did. Those who chose to be racist could do so, but it was at the peril of their team. You could be a racist. Nobody forced them to take blacks. No one came in and forced anybody to take blacks. But baseball was integrated by the late 50s. Everybody wanted to. This was Carver's vision. It's too bad he couldn't have seen it happen. You make yourself indispensable, and then they want you. Even if they don't like you, they want you. Football, similar. 1946 integration. Cleveland Browns. Marion Motley, running back, pass catcher. He averaged in his years with the Browns 5.7 yards per carry, the highest in the history of the National Football League. He was a powerful running back. And Cleveland, gee, I wonder how they did with him. This is before the Super Bowl. They had the NFL championship. They also, it was called American Athletic Conference Championship. That was before the NFL. They called them, they had a different name, and then in 1950 they had the NFL. But it was the same kind of organization. Detroit, the Cleveland Browns win the championship, 1946, rookie year of Marion Motley. 1947, 1948, 1949, 1950. Does anybody see a pattern here? But 1954, 1955. They won 7 out of 10 years. The last team, anybody guess what was the last team in 1962 to integrate football? National Football League team. They didn't make it into the playoffs this year either. Anybody hazard a guess?
Colts.
No? But I mean, thank you for trying. At least he tried. The Washington Redskins. It was the Redskins. They were called the Redskins because the founder, George Preston Marshall, founded what's now the Atlanta Braves, and he wanted to separate the Braves and the Redskins name. And so that's where he got that. So it was the Washington Redskins, and they had no blacks, and they won the NFL before the blacks came in. Remember I said 1946 was the first year that the NFL was integrated? They won in 1945. They won the whole, Washington did. Then they refused to integrate, and they were the last one. And the 2 years, in 1960 and 61, they won. The season was 14 games. Actually, they switched. It was 12 games in 1960, and they raised it to 14 in 1961. The Washington Redskins won 1 game each season. And the one that they won in 1960 was a victory over a team that went 0-14, which was oddly enough the Dallas Cowboys. They were a new team. That was their first year. They got off to an 0-14 start. And Washington beat them. Then they finally integrate, and George Marshall, you know, he just hated to do it, but he finally did. And they bring in Bobby Mitchell, who's in the Hall of Fame. And Bobby Mitchell came and was both a running back and a wide receiver. He mainly was wide receiver. And let's see, the first game, okay, now they're integrated. They got Bobby Mitchell, and they brought another black in. But Mitchell was the main one. Bobby Mitchell in the opening game, not on the first kickoff, but shortly thereafter, ran the kickoff 92 yards for a touchdown and caught 2 touchdown passes, and Washington wins. Second game, they beat the Cleveland Browns 17-16 with a touchdown in the last minute, a 50-yard touchdown caught by Bobby Mitchell. They win the third game, 2 touchdown passes to Bobby Mitchell. Bobby Mitchell led the league in touchdown passes, led the NFL in 19. And so now we have the Redskins winning. They won more games in their first 3 than they did in the 2 previous seasons once they integrated. What I'm suggesting is this just makes it obvious. All of this done. Isn't it exciting? There was no government program that did any of it. It was strictly George Washington Carver saying, we can't get in the door until we show we belong in the room. We need to show we belong in the room, and once we're in the room, then people will give us more of a chance, and then we can show our stuff. George Washington Carver never lived to see the vision. But he said, limited government, and do not go out there. He said, you go out there and fight these people. First of all, you become useless because you're so busy hating, you're not inventing, and you're going to have to put up with it. Carver said, listen, you don't know how much fun it gave me toward the end sometimes to be in a room and to see all of those people. And they saw that I had to come up on the back elevator, and they all were getting lunch, and I got nothing. I got nothing. They were embarrassed. Sometimes they gave me their own food. He said, I don't care if those people come and take it. I want to try to give you my food. He said, the embarrassment creates opportunities for us. If I go up there and demand to have my meal, it would be much more, it would be probably ineffective. That isn't the way I'm going to do it. We're going to stand up for the rights as much as we can. We're not going to get caught up in the details. I'm going to spend my time in my lab, and I'm going to make myself indispensable. And that's what I want you to do in your communities when you graduate. That was George Washington Carver. That is a lesson for Black History Month that shows that the bad part of our history, the embarrassing part, had some people who came in and accomplished something that made a difference. My final statement: Black Americans constitute 4% of the world's Black population. I'm looking around, nobody's surprised. That sound about right? 4% of the Blacks in the world are here. Anybody care to guess what percentage of Black millionaires are in the United States? Andrew hit it on the button. Did I tell you about that before class? No, we didn't. 90% of Black millionaires are in the United States, with 4% of the population. I think in part, but in part, that is the work, that's a follow-up to the work of George Washington Carver, creating those kinds of opportunities. He helped get that going. Thank you. Okay.
Are there questions for Dr. Folsom? And I'll bring you the mic if you raise your hand.
First, thanks so much for the talk. That was really good. I'm interested in the Reconstruction period because
Okay.
it's evident that Black Southerners were eager to raise literacy rates and get education. I mean, they were they saw the importance of that at the time. And Reconstruction opened up a lot of opportunities for, as you mentioned, Northern businesses and philanthropists to contribute to that project, right?
Correct.
You were talking a little bit later, but you mentioned Rockefeller donating money for a laboratory, right?
Yes.
That goes right back to the end of the Civil War. I mean, I think Sears and Roebuck were really heavily involved in building schools across the South in the 60s and 70s after the Civil War. And so I was just wondering if you had any other examples of that, if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between Northern business and philanthropy and Southern drive for education, and what the interplay between those two things are.
I don't have a lot of examples, but you've hit on it. I've given a few. I'll give you one more. The Slater Foundation was a foundation set up by the Slater family to help with providing opportunities for Black Americans during Reconstruction and after. They put in charge of it Rutherford B. Hayes, who was the president in the 1870s. Hayes, when he was a general in the Civil War, came out and campaigned for governor. And a proposition was on the ballot to give Blacks the vote in Ohio. This is before 1870. Right, when the 15th Amendment made that. But this was before that. We didn't know if we could get the 15th Amendment. In Ohio, was going to give Blacks the right to vote. He favored and ran on it, and he wrapped himself around that. He was such a hero in the state, He won the election for governor and the amendment lost. Isn't that neat though? He was willing to do that. The Slater Foundation's, then he was president. After he was president, he went right to work for the Slater Foundation.
Thanks.
Yeah. Neat.
Bert, being as this is a business school, you've chosen examples from academia, which I love, George Washington Carver, and there were a lot of spillovers into business. But I wonder if there are any examples that come to mind of business people, Black businesses that contributed to either their own communities or to the general prosperity that you can think of.
Yeah, there are some good ones. In fact, when Dr. Matchek invited me to come, and I was excited because this is the first time I've lectured on this, and I wanted to do it. So thank you for being the guinea pig audience. But what I did, I started with, I said, well, because Madam C.J. Walker is the first Black millionaire, and she, in hair care products, was extremely effective. And there's even a Netflix series, some of you may have seen, on Madam Walker and her life and her business. And yeah, the Johnson family that founded Ebony magazine. I mean, Michael Jordan and Oprah Winfrey are now billionaires. So you're back to the sports world, but they're business people too. But you have various inventions, like Garrett Morgan invented the stoplight. Look at the accidents, And I mentioned Shirley Jackson, who's an entrepreneur of sorts, and inventing the portable fax machine and the touch tone dialing. And so you have the caller ID. Boy, aren't you glad we have caller ID so those telemarketers show right up on your phone? These are business people who have produced products that are good. But I thought I could do that, but then I missed the story. There's a story that happened in the 1800s and the 1900s. And Black business is going to come in and have more opportunities because of that. And I thought, let's tell the story and let another time fill in some of these business people. They came along after to take advantage of the opportunities that Carver and others helped to give them. You can't have an entrepreneurship without freedom. And you can't have freedom unless you have the right to vote and you have some civil rights. And we couldn't get those until the Blacks showed themselves to be somewhat indispensable. And so that's the focus. But that's a very good question. And I'm sorry if I didn't talk enough about business people. Go ahead. Anything else? Anybody else? How many knew about, some of you identified Carver, but how many did not know much about George Washington Carver? Wow. Yeah, well, I'm excited because he's one of my favorites. I sometimes, if you're a bit like me, because he used to go on walks with Booker T. Washington around Tuskegee and they talk about things, I thought, geez, I'd like to be there. I wish I could be there to hear what they talked about. Talking about strategy, tactics, talking about getting the inventions that they have out to the people, changing, because it was all about changing the world, and they did it. I wish they'd have lived to have seen more good things come from it, but they laid the foundation that Black Americans built on. That was the subject of my talk. I don't want to keep anything because you may have hard tests that Dr. Moots, that Dr. Matchek, and others, here we're going to give you those hard tests. And so I don't want to be here causing you to miss the opportunity to read the exciting material that I know that they have assigned.
Thank you very much, Dr. Folsom, for tonight's lecture. And thank you for being here. And don't forget, check the website for the entire schedule of Freedom Seminar events. Beginning next week at 6 o'clock. I hope to see many of you here again. And for those of you that are in my class, which is called the Freedom Seminar, I want you to stay behind because we have unfinished business. And the rest of you have a good evening.